Hey guys, Sly here. Actually, before we start this, I need to find the slip of paper that I use, because I don't know where it went. Yeah, because it's not this one. God damn it. This is what happens when you rush through an entire, thing. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I need to really reorganize my desk. But anyways, welcome back to the Caspian Game Awards. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the magical year of 1993. Everyone's favorite year in gaming, right? You know? Yeah. Okay. But, of course, I hope you guys are pretty excited about tonight's episode. If I'm going to be honest, this was a pretty hard one to research for. And I'm not going to lie, it's definitely going to be a lot harder as we go into the early 90s as less and less games start getting documented. And so because of that, doing the research for this is going to be pretty spotty at best. And so I hope you guys, if you guys can, please support the content. I would definitely appreciate you guys because, oh my god, this was pretty hard to try to research everything on an individual level. That's why it took another extra day for me to be able to do this. So I do apologize for that. But in any event, of course, if you guys are new to the series, basically we do our own sort of game awards for most of the years in gaming history. We're going up into the year 1990. This year we'll be doing 1993. And 93 was fine. Like, if I'm going to be honest, the way in which I feel about 1993 is kind of the same feeling that I felt about 2003, if you guys have seen that episode. It wasn't a particularly bad year, it's just a lot of the crap that came out from this year is infamous. I mean, let's be real here, this was the year that brought us the very infamously terrible Zelda CDI games. So, yeah. Not to mention, this was around the time when the Sega CD was really starting to ramp up a lot of the crap that was getting released on that thing. So, it was kind of a crapshoot year, if I'm going to be honest. That being said, though, there were still plenty of good games that I was able to find, as always. And we're going to be mentioning a lot of kind of underground, in air quotes, games, like a lot of games that I can certainly guarantee you that the younger audience is definitely not going to really know about, but I've actually played myself and I think are actually pretty cool in their own respects. And so, and if I'm going to be honest, I mean, this is the last year of the mid-90s, and so we're really getting into, well, the grunge era. I mean, we kind of already were in the grunge era if we're kind of talking about big cultural zeitgeists that were going on at the time. And considering that this is the Super Nintendo era and the Sega Genesis era, there's definitely going to be a lot more IPs that aren't as familiar to a lot of younger gamers. A lot of older gamers are definitely going to remember a lot of these games. And, well, with the power of my little device right here, Super Nintendo Classic, I've been able to play as many of these games as possible. Granted, there are still some DOS games on here that I had to scourge a little bit for, but trust me when I say this, I've done as much research as I can for this, and I'm going to make sure that I do the same thing once we get to the early 90s, because God help us, I'm gonna need it. So, but either way, I guess that's all I gotta really say. 1993 was just kind of an okay year. Not terrible, but the stuff that was bad was really, really bad. But the stuff that was good from this year was actually really, really good. And so let's talk about those. Of course, for those who are needing a refresher on the rules, these are pretty much the rules that we've set up for a while now. And these are our stipulations. So, of course, as always, as far as what gets nominated, it has to have been released within that entire year frame. We're not doing cutoff dates because, again, we're not the Grammys, we're not the Oscars.
Don't yell at me, yell at the Grammys.
We're not in any of that. None of that. So we don't do weird cutoff dates. We do the entire year because I want to represent games for that year entirely. And also, of course, only 4 to 6 games per category, so that we're not bloating we're not bloating the list too much, but also we're not having too little choices. I will say there was a few categories that it was definitely starting to become a bit slim for. So do keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that initial releases are counted, not just North American releases. So we are counting, especially once we get into this era, which we've kind of been doing for a while. There's going to be a lot of games that we're going to be talking about that had Japanese releases in 93, but wouldn't be released in North America until 94, even 95, even 96 in some cases. So if you are confused as to why a game is here and it wasn't there, that's why. Because I count initial releases. So those are just the general nominee stuff. As far as game of the year, basically they got to be a generally liked game to be accepted. Though in the absolute rare cases, I'll just start nominating games that I personally liked if it's a particularly bad year. Thankfully, 93 wasn't that bad. But oh my god, I'm kind of worried about 90 and 91. But that's a story for another day. And also keep in mind, we're only going to be choosing games that I'm personally interested in, because I'm someone who really cares more about the aesthetics and all that fun stuff. So if you don't like that, well then, okay. And again, keep in mind, this is all just my personal opinion as always. So if you guys disagree, of course, feel free to comment. And of course, I will be doing a Redux stream on all of these at some point next year. But in any event, of course, let's showcase our categories. Again, we only have 8 this time, so this is not going to be too long of a stream, though I will admit I literally finished working on this slideshow literally as I was starting this, because this was kind of rough doing the research. Again, it wasn't a bad year. Don't get it twisted. 93, I think, is far from being one of the worst years we've talked about. But because we are so far removed, this is 31 years ago. That's a long ass time. Hell, again, I wasn't even born. And hell, a lot of the people that are probably popular on YouTube right now, they're probably not as old as this. So we're really going back in time with this one. And also with that, keep in mind, and we kind of already touched with it with a few of the more recent episodes, keep in mind, things are going to start looking pretty dated. And so, and as I mean dated, I mean not just in the typical, there might be some offensive imagery here, but we're also going to be talking stuff that is very much just general game design of that era. And so because of that, we're just looking at this through the perspective of, did the games hold up at that time? Like, were they innovative for the time? And do they even still hold up to this day? That's essentially what I'm looking at with this perspective. That's kind of been the case with every single one of these episodes that we've talked about, is, were the games themselves good for their time, and were they games that have also held up? But these last 4 years of the 90s we're going to be talking about, that's going to especially be the case. So I hope you guys are at least going to be willing to at least hear that out. But either way, let's begin, starting off with the best game by a new studio, which, oddly enough, 93 had a lot of examples of games that qualified for this, which is weird because typically we only have about 4 choices max, and hell, there are several years where we didn't even have this as a category. But yeah, no, 1993 had a decent amount of big debuts that came out. Not just studio-wise, but even franchise-wise. And that really put things into perspective on just how 93 surprisingly was actually a pretty important year for gaming history as a whole. For some for better, some for worse. But as far as the games that we will be talking about here, these are what I ended up choosing. And I will admit, some of these names are not, well, most of these names are not particularly familiar to a lot of gamers. And hell, most just general audiences definitely don't even know the names of these. So let's talk about them. Let's start off with The Lost Vikings, which was a puzzle platformer that was released for the Super Nintendo and I believe for DOS systems, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a little decent experience. Nothing that was like too flashy for the time. But this is actually a very important debut. Because if you recall on our 97 episode, we actually talked about the sequel for this. And that's because this game was made by a little known company that would eventually aspire to do great things, but also terrible things. But we'll focus on the great things for now. So, have you guys ever heard of a company called Silicon and Synapse? Again, a bit of an old school name. But there's a code word for them. They're called Blizzard! Yes! This was the first major Blizzard game that was released. Yes. Okay, now keep in mind, again, as you saw with the title card, this is not technically the first game. This is the first game that got these studios' attention. And Lost Vikings got them a decent amount of attention at the time. So, and this also explains why, well, they went for a fantasy light aesthetic with stuff like Warcraft, or even Blackthorn that they would release a year later, even though that one's more sci-fi-ish, but you get the point. They have roots in fantasy games. And yeah, this was the first game that got them over 100,000 copies sold. So, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, no, this game is pretty important in a lot of ways. And like I said, it's actually a pretty decent little platformer. So if you want something that's a bit more out of the tooth, Lost Viking is a decent choice for that. So yeah, pretty big right there. But let's move on to something a bit more obscure. Something that a lot of you 90s gamers are definitely going to know about. We've got The Seventh Guest, which was made by a studio called Triliobytes. Again, not particularly the biggest company that's known, but The Seventh Guest was one of those kind of point-and-click adventure games that was very popular at the time. But what made this one stand out is just sort of the visual presentation, it being a lot more horror adjacent compared to a lot of other point and clicks that were at the time, and just being a bit more, well, utilizing a lot of 3D graphics, which was a very new thing for gaming at the time. 3D fully 3D graphics were starting to finally break out around 93. And this game helped utilize that. Which some of these games that we'll talk about in a little bit also did help with that. But I think just the fact that this was kind of like a mystery, horror, adventure, point-and-click game, I think that is what helped at least ease that in for a lot of people. And so, I want to at least give it some credit where credit is due. And then we got ourselves Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. This was, I think it was a JRPG. Again, if you see me typing, it's just to refresh myself on these, because god damn it, I've had to look up so much shit. Yes, this is a JRPG made by Neverland. And they would eventually make the sequel to this, as well as some other, lesser known games, but this was one of the games that was a part of the big height of JRPGs of the 90s. Because, the mid 90s, as we've discussed in the previous episodes, was probably the peak point in which JRPGs reigned supreme, especially on the Super Nintendo. And this was just another example of just a generally pretty solid JRPG, especially by a new upcoming studio. And so, yeah, if you just wanted some more of that, this is a decent one to mess around with. And then we got the Master of Orion, which of course is definitely on the more sci-fi thing, or more sci-fi side of things. It's like a strategy game. It took a lot of inspiration from the Civilization games of more Civilization 1 at the time, because remember, Civilization wasn't a franchise quite yet. It was made by a studio called Simtax. They would eventually make the sequel to this, as well as some other railroad simulation games. And as far as being a pseudo-competitor to Civilization, basically just being Civilization but exclusively a science fiction game, you could do a lot worse. So, yeah. Generally speaking, I will admit, these last three pickings are not necessarily the most noteworthy, but I guess just the fact that these were pretty decent little entries by up-and-coming studios, the equivalent of, indie studios, I guess, at the time. Indie is kind of a broad term. Well, maybe not in the case of Master Orion, because they published their game through Microprose, and they were a big publisher at the time. But just the fact that, I don't know, I guess these games are just generally highly regarded games in their respective genres, and so I wanted to give them a bit of nod. But then we've got ourselves another pretty big name as far as its respective genre, and that's Myst. So Myst was made by, let me refresh myself if I apologize. It was made by a studio called Cyan, who would eventually be known as Cyan Worlds. And, well, this is probably the most well-known thing they've made. It is a puzzle game, a puzzle adventure game, actually not too dissimilar to The Seventh Guest, though the main difference is that one was still kind of more of a traditional point-and-click. I guess both of these are still point-and-click games, but this one was definitely more involved with just general puzzle solving. And, well, this game, the entirety of the game is set on that island right there. You're seeing the entirety of the game right there. So, there's no cutaway areas. It just uses the entirety of this fictional island for you to sort of uncover its own mystery and solve tons of puzzles along your journey. And it was a game that got a lot of positive press, specifically for just a lot of its sort of whimsical, but also just kind of mysterious vibe that it got. And that's especially helped nowadays because, the graphics are obviously pretty dated now, but for the time, they were a big deal. And it could lead to some sort of unsettling, but also just intriguing, I guess, just kind of mind tricks, I guess? I don't know. Point is, Myst is one of those games that really did help push the boundaries for puzzle games. And so that's why we're putting it for the best game by new studio. So, again, not the most well-known names anymore, but for the time, it makes sense why I should nominate these games. But ultimately, we can only have one winner, and so, of course, let's go over said winner. So, I will admit, it should be pretty obvious what's going to be the winner here, and if I'm going to be honest, from this point onwards, it's going to be pretty obvious what's going to be the winner, if you guys know me. But let's do it. So, the award for the best game by new studio for 1993 goes to Myst. I know some people would definitely argue that for Blizzard with the Lost Vikings, that could have been a good choice. But if I'm going to be honest, Lost Vikings wasn't really that big of a splash when it came to platformers. But with Myst, it makes a lot more sense for us to have this as the winner, because this was really a big boundary pusher for puzzle and adventure games as a whole. So obviously, there's a lot more. Like, the reason why this game got a lot of attention is not just because it was a fully 3D game, but it was also because the puzzles themselves were a lot more player involved compared to other games at the time. Because typically with a lot of puzzle and adventure games from around the early 90s, typically you just kind of look around to see what you can pick up or find, point at it, and then you're pretty much good to go. But with Myst, there was a lot more player involvement where you actually had to turn cranks, or you had to actually pull levers, you had to actually use a lot of the environment to try to figure out whatever sort of riddle or puzzle you're trying to go through. There was a lot more puzzles that were actively that had it to where the player was a lot more involved rather than just looking for a small individual thing for them to do. And that's what helped Myst get a lot of attention at the time. Is that it was a lot more brain-based, like a lot more it basically was just taking a lot of like education game tropes, but applying them into a more general adventure setting. So, and well, it's helped by the fact that this game has a pretty iconic for adventure game standards world. I mean, this is a pretty, like, if you're a 90s gamer, this is actually one of the most iconic locations just in any game from that time period. And, well, it's a test of time as far as I'm concerned. So that's generally why we're going to give this one the win, is that it helped push a lot of boundaries, and of course being one of the first fully 3D games, I have to give this one the win. So it just makes sense. But let's talk about other action adventure games just in general, because I will admit there were a lot of games within just this category that I could have chosen. But I ultimately just chose the ones that interested me the most for this category. So let's go over those. So yeah, some familiar names are popping up now, even if you license games here and there. But let's start off by talking about Alone in the Dark the Second, Alone in the Dark 2. So, of course, this is the sequel to Alone in the Dark from the previous year. This, of course, really wasn't too different from the first Alone in the Dark, but just the fact that it was in a different setting, it was a lot more focused on just you know, theming of pirates as opposed to just being a haunted mansion. It was something that was a unique take on just horror media. So, like, just being on a mysterious pirate ship. Not the biggest trope until, funny enough, the past, 20 years, it was still kind of a newish trope at the time. Or at least as far as, survival horror, or just horror media in general. So as far as I'm concerned, it makes sense for them to at least touch the waters and something like that, pun intended. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I just nominated this because Alone in the Dark has always been a pretty influential game. And I think the sequel did a good enough job trying to justify itself. And then we got Gauntlet 4. Yes, Gauntlet 4. This is part of a long-running series of hack and slash games for the Sega, or for Sega consoles, in this case the Sega Genesis. And this was seen as a massive improvement compared to the previous game, because the previous game didn't really particularly do all that well. But as far as just beat 'em up hack and slash games are concerned, okay, this isn't really a beat 'em up, it's just more of a general action hack and slash game. It's just a decent time. I'm not going to pretend it's like, an amazing experience, because there's definitely arguably better games that did this style, but because it's a fantasy setting and I like this sort of stuff, I wanted to at least give it an honorable nod, especially considering that I feel like the Sega Genesis has some hidden gems that people don't really know about anymore, and I wanted to give a shout out to Gauntlet. So if you like old school old action fantasy games that aren't particularly role playing, Gauntlet is for you. Which, well, speaking of, our Game Boy representative here, Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. So, again, as I already mentioned, this year was already pretty cursed for Zelda as a whole because of those goddamn CDI games. Oh my god. That was awful. But there at least was one light at the end of that, Zelda tunnel at the time. And that was this little scrappy Game Boy game that was released. And for a Game Boy original game, this is honestly really damn good for what it is. Now, it's not a perfect game, of course, because it is on Game Boy. It is pretty limited on what you're able to do. But the fact that they were able to basically just make a game that isn't too different from Link to the Past onto a device like the original Game Boy, that's already impressive alone. So, yeah, that's all I gotta really say. Is it's basically just a Link to the Past, except with a different story, of course, I am well aware, but for handhelds, and it actually translates pretty well. So, I've got really nothing else to complain right there. But now let's move on to licensed territory. Let's talk about the Super Nintendo version of Jurassic Park. And yes, I have to specify, because again, this is the time frame, well, actually, the 90s and 2000s in general, were just the eras in which the console and PC versions or just console versions between each other were drastically different. And so we're not talking about the Sega Genesis version here. Or even the DOS version. We are strictly talking about the Super Nintendo version. And it's a little decent top-down adventure game. Just, avoiding dinosaurs and caging them up. Just, obviously, it strays very much differently from the source material that it comes from. That's pretty typical for a lot of licensed games from this time period. But whenever I was playing it, I actually thought it was pretty decent. It wasn't actually that bad. As far as I'm concerned, This is one of the underrated, like, hidden gems of the Super Nintendo. And, you know, it's based off of a movie that I actually really respect, even though I acknowledge it's probably the only good movie in that franchise, which sucks. But at the end of the day, as far as movie tie-in games, especially for a movie that came out the same year as this game, this is actually one of the better ones I've played, and that's saying a lot, because there's so many bad movie license games from this time period, like from the 90s and 2000s. Oh my god, it's actually embarrassing. But as far as this goes, I don't know, this one just is kind of cool. Go seek it out if you haven't already. And then, of course, we got ourselves the second in the Super Star Wars trilogy of, you know, Star Wars games for the Super Nintendo. Super Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. Again, this one's just another pretty fun game. It really didn't do too much different from the first Super Star Wars game. It was just an enjoyable, you know, retelling of the movie. Which is funny because this came out 13 years after. But as far as late release, like movie tie-in release games, whatever you want to call this, I actually thought this one was also pretty damn good. It is hard as fuck, though. And that's kind of one of the things that is pretty infamous about the Super Star Wars trilogy in general. But this game is, like, it doesn't make me pissed. It offers a huge challenge, but it's nothing that isn't bullshit or unfair, for the most part. And I just think that's pretty respectable in its own right. And so because of that, yeah, I want to give this game a bit of a shout out. And then last but not least, we got ourselves Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Father. I think I gave a shout out to its sequel for the 95 Caspian Game Awards, but this is the original game. Essentially, it's like a detective adventure game, which really was this. It really did help popularize that being a massive trope in a lot of games. It's just the rogue detective type, which I know that is a bit of a joke. It's a bit of a meme, especially with games like Max Payne or like fucking, I don't know, like, you know, Disco Elysium or something like that. And yes, this was kind of the game that started that sort of trope in gaming. That being said, though, this was actually a pretty intriguing story about just, well, going through the life of someone who went through a bit of a traumatic experience. And just kind of adding in the spooky supernatural elements really does actually make this surprisingly stand out compared to other games that are like it. Because it's not just a straightforward cop drama. It has like some, you know, psychological horror elements in it. And that's something that I think is actually pretty cool about this game. And so, yeah, if you want something, if you want a game that is a bit of a cop, like, you know, the rogue cop type, but has a supernatural element, Gabriel Knight is actually not that bad of a choice. Hell, there was a re-release that came out 10 years ago. So, if that piques your interest, this might be something worth checking out. So, but let's go over the winner, because these are very, very specific types of games, but they still kind of fit into the action-adventure category. And so it is admittedly kind of hard to choose which game is the best, because the games are very different from each other. But I think regardless, I think what I ended up choosing is probably for the best. And of course, we'll discuss it. So let's go over the winner. So the award for the best action adventure game of 1993 goes to Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. And I forgot to type the name of the game at the bottom. God damn it. Hold on, I'll fix that right now. But I guess I might as well talk about Link's Awakening while we're here. So, admittedly, it is a safe choice. Link's Awakening, it's like, oh, it's just, this is another Zelda game. Of course, you're probably going to choose it because, Zelda is extremely popular. Yeah, but, here's the thing specifically about Link's Awakening that you have to keep in mind. So, okay, but first of all, let's talk about just some of the smaller points. So, first of all, the map. Honestly, this is probably one of the easier maps to navigate around when it comes to any Zelda game. Especially since, well, you've got yourself... it's basically... Think of it as basically if Link to the Past had a similar map style of the first Zelda game. That's essentially what it is. And, some people might say, oh, doesn't that make that sound like it's going to be more confusing? No, because each time you go to a new area, it's mapped on the side. And so pretty much in general where you're going to be at all times. And I think that makes it a lot more enjoyable and a lot more easily digestible for a lot of people to get into something like this. So, ultimately, I think that's something that really does help in the long run. And of course, being a Zelda game, it should really go without saying. Sound design, music is always pretty good. Which is also pretty impressive considering that the Game Boy was notorious for having kind of shitty remixes of a lot of games. So the fact that they were able to still keep the Zelda tone intact is pretty impressive. There's also some cool new movement sets that were introduced in this game that, funny enough, weren't even in Link to the Past. For example, you can actually jump, which that might not sound like that's a big deal, but trust me, it is a huge deal with a game like this. So, the fact that they were able to do that is pretty cool. But here's ultimately why this is getting the win. This is on the Game Boy, not the Super Nintendo. The fact that they were able to offer the same exact experience, or at least as close to an experience to the console version of Zelda, well, the good console versions of Zelda, and still was able to make it its own. That, to me, is what makes this impressive. Especially since the Game Boy, let's be real here, wasn't really the best handheld system ever. I mean, yeah, it outlasted both the Game Gear and the Atari Lynx. But it was mostly because of its cheapness and its convenience. I mean, to be fair, it's better than the Tiger Electronic games. I'd rather hit Game Boy than a Tiger Electronic game any day of the fucking week. But as far as a Game Boy experience, if I'm gonna be honest, this is probably the best game, original Game Boy game that has ever been released, and I will stand by that. So that's ultimately why I'm choosing this as the win. The fact that it was able to do that damn well is ultimately why we're choosing this as the best action-adventure game. So that's what it boils down to. But now let's move on to Best Platformer. Which should not surprise you that there were still plenty of platformers for me to choose from, as this was a oversaturated genre at the time. Mascot platformer after mascot platformer, cinematic platformer after cinematic platformer. They were all over the shit as far as releases for 93. Plenty good, plenty bad. But as far as the good ones, here you go. So let's start off with Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame. Yes, a name we've not mentioned in a while on this series. And yes, I am just gonna say this right now. Yes, Prince of Persia has been a franchise since the very late 80s, and this is the sequel to the 1989 game. And normally, I wouldn't really like a game like this, because, I mean, Prince of Persia is highly credited as being one of the first, if not the first, cinematic platformers. And it pretty much made it to where it was a more, I don't want to say realistic, because this game's not realistic at all, but it gave a lot more of a relatable feeling when it came to the protagonist and just the general world. Normally, I wouldn't really like these types of games, though, or at least a game like this. Not because of that element, but because of the fact that this game has a timer. Yeah, there's a time, like, there's an artificial time limit in the game. I usually despise that shit. But what makes this game at least respectable for me is the general art direction that this game has. Because this game visually is a massive jump compared to the previous game. Which makes sense since this came out 4 years after, like 3.5, 4 years after. But this at least looks like they put in a lot of effort. Even if a lot of the enemies don't really make any sense for Persian mythology, but that's a whole other conversation I really don't want to have. But as far as improving upon your first game, I think Shadow in the Flame is an improvement in many different ways. So, yeah, Shadow in the Flame, I recommend. But then let's go back to the Sega Genesis. Because, well, this was a DOS game. Or, yeah, Prince of Persia 2, that was a DOS game. Let's go back to Genesis. This was the last game in the Shinobi series for Sega Genesis. This was kind of their response to the Ninja Gaiden series. And so, I will admit, like, it's not as fun to play as Ninja Gaiden, but if you want an alternative, this is actually not that bad of a choice. You could have done a lot worse as far as competing with Ninja Gaiden. And I don't know, just having an action platformer like this, I don't know, I just find it to be pretty fun. Again, more acrobatic platformers I tend to gravitate towards the most. Probably because I really do like a lot of games that do a lot of parkouring. I mean, we're finishing up our Assassin's Creed 2 playthrough tomorrow. I'm excited about that. I know that's not a platformer, but you get the point. I just like being able to play games like that. And this at least offers a little bit of that. So, yeah. Alright. Super Nintendo time. ActRaiser 2. Sequel to ActRaiser from 91. Though, this one also is more of an action platformer, but it's not like an acrobatic action platformer. It's just kind of a more of a traditional platformer, just with a fantasy tinge to it. And it's alright. I think it's more held up by its general art direction, I do feel like, as opposed to its gameplay. But it's still a decent little Super Nintendo game that I'd recommend anyone check out, even if it's kind of more, admittedly, on the basic side of things. I don't know. I guess, again, just that the fantasy aspect to it, I'm a sucker for. So, I mean, you guys know me, I love fantasy, so I'm gonna be biased, okay? So, whatever, it's fine. But yeah, it's just a decent little game. But then we got ourselves, let's get back to some teeth. Castlevania Rondo of Blood. So, and this, to be frank, we're not talking about Dracula X. As a matter of fact, that was basically a port/remake of this game for the Super Nintendo. We are talking about the original Amiga 32X. I believe that is what this originally released in, but only in Japan. Obviously, since then they have re-released this for PlayStation 4 alongside Symphony of the Night, as this is the direct predecessor to Symphony of the Night, and it shows in pretty much every single way except for the fact that there's no leveling system in here. And this game basically It's like, why the hell did America not get this version? Why not? This game is awesome. I mean, I will admit it's not as good as Castlevania 4 or Symphony of the Night, but it's still a really good in-between game. Like, it has really fluid animations. It has solid gameplay. Like, it has solid action combat. Just the general color palette that they use is so damn good. Like, just using a lot of those blues and purples to create Dracula's castle, as well as just kind of the surrounding areas, it looks so damn good. Now, I will say, this was funny enough, though, even though Symphony of the Night was technically the first game, that was the first game to popularize the anime look for Castlevania, funny enough, this was the first game to just straight up do it. Or at least the Japanese version. They got rid of a lot of that in the in the re-releases on recent consoles. But yeah, no, the original Japanese version of Rondo of Blood had anime-like cutscenes, which I will admit did not work in place with the gameplay at all. But yeah, you can thank this game technically for that anime aesthetic for Castlevania. Technically. I still think I prefer Symphony of the Night and how that direction went from that point onwards. But Rondo of Blood is still a game that I would recommend, regardless of version. So, well, not the Dracula X Super Nintendo version. That's just a compromise version in every single way. Just get the PS4/5 version. So, or Xbox. No, it's not on Xbox. That's right. It's on PlayStation only right now. Unless, is it in the Castlevania collection? I don't remember. Let me double check that. Yeah, the anniversary collection. Shit. No, it's not. Damn. Alright, well, you guys are gonna have to go PlayStation then. Haha. Okay, all jokes aside, Rondo of Blood is a decent game. And I recommend you guys check it out. So, and well, that then leads us into probably the one game that I have a feeling everyone is scratching their heads right now and are like, what, Duke Nukem 2, why is Duke Nukem here? I thought that was a first-person shooter. Well, my dear friends, you guys are not gonna believe this. If younglings, sit down for a little bit. Papa Sly has got a story for you. Okay, I'm never calling myself that ever again. Jesus Christ. Okay. Back in the early 90s, Duke Nukem did not start off as a shooter game. It started off as a platformer series. I am not joking. Duke Nukem 2, Duke Nukem 1 and 2 were platformers. I don't know how. It makes no goddamn sense as far as what you're seeing on your goddamn screen. Because does this read platformer to you? Does that read platformer to you? No. But it was. I'm sorry. Again, it's just funny in hindsight, considering that Duke Nukem 3D would be made 3 years later, and that's the most popular game in the series by far. It's not even a contest, and that's a first-person shooter. I don't know. It's just funny in hindsight. But yeah, no, Duke Nukem started off as a 3D platformer series. Though I will admit, it really just depends on this, like, how you play it. Because this was originally released on DOS and Amiga systems at the time. It was not a console release. But if I'm going to be honest, I think this game, funny enough, plays better on a console because I actually emulated this game on my Super Nintendo, and if I'm going to be honest, it actually plays way better than it does on a PC. And hell, there was even a few years ago, there was like a little mini console release that contained this and Duke Nukem 3D on it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's actually a decent way to play it. So, again, it just depends on how you play it, but it's actually a decent little platformer. I know, that's weird to call Duke Nukem a really good platformer. But yeah, no, Duke Nukem 2 is actually pretty decent. And also did some quality of life changes compared to the first game. Like, increasing the range of the camera and all that fun stuff. So yeah, no, Duke Nukem 2, not too shabby. But is it Mega Man X, though? Because, yes, at the end of 93... in Japan, keep in mind, because I know this was released in February 94 in America, but we're talking about initial releases. Mega Man X came out. And this completely changed the franchise, as far as I'm concerned. It went away from a lot of the whole Dr. Wily thing. And it focused on 2 new heroes. Although technically, mostly X in this case, although Zero was in the game, lest we not forget about that. And it pretty much was just a massive overhaul that, at least in my opinion, was kind of necessary for Mega Man, because I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I'm the biggest fan of like the NES Mega Man games, if I'm gonna be honest. And there's all the 80s and early 90s game, like, kids hating on me. I'm sorry. It just, like, the older Mega Man games for the NES just feel a bit too stiff for me. I much prefer the way in which this game controls. And if I'm gonna be... it's funny because I completely forgot that I did stream this game at some point. Like... yeah, I streamed this back in 2018 or 19. I need to check the file. I still have that stream saved. But yeah, I just remember playing it for some weird reason. Even though I sucked ass at it back then. But now I'm an actual fucking god at this game. Because this game is actually pretty good as well. I highly recommend you guys, check it out if you haven't already. But let's go over the winner. So... the award for the 1993 platformer goes to... I gotta be real. Mega Man X. It's Mega Man X. Though I will admit, Rondo Blood is close, but the real answer is Mega Man X. And this is coming from someone who used to not give a shit about Mega Man. And... even earlier this year has ranted about the fact that, well, let's just say that Mega Man was pretty much not necessarily okay. I originally didn't like the general look of Mega Man. It was just too 80s for me personally, and a part of me is still kind of like that, at least for the OG Mega Man series. But as far as I'm concerned, Mega Man X is the much needed overhaul that the franchise needed at this point, because it was starting to get pretty stale for the original trilogy. Well, not the original trilogy, the original Hexology, because people forget that the first 6 Mega Man games were all NES exclusives. And they were milking that system dry even as late as 93. Mega Man X was the much needed response that we needed. It streamlined pretty much every issue that I had with the older Mega Man games. It's a lot more snappy as far as, button prompts and actions that you can do in the game. Obviously, the game is going to look a lot more vibrant, as this is a Super Nintendo game, so obviously that's naturally going to be there. But also, this game has way much needed movement sets in here, especially the much needed and much thankfully added a climbing mechanic that you can use if you want to scale up walls. That shit is so much fun to use, especially if you're using it to shoot against the many different bosses and enemies that you'll be encountering in this game. And that then leads me into what I think I do appreciate this, at least in comparison to the other Mega Man games, up until this point. Because we're focusing on a different protagonist, and because we are focusing more on just a general wave of different enemies this time around, as well as a completely different cast, this allows for a lot more of a more maturing of themes that they could have showcased, and that they do even somewhat showcase in this game. I mean, it's still, I think, like a rated E10 game, which I know that's not, go from rated E to like rated E10. I know Esper just came out in 93, but whatever. You get my point. The older Mega Man games were pretty much self-contained, and honestly is a pretty just straightforward game as far as I'm concerned. But with Mega Man X, the fact that they were making the designs at least a bit more, I don't want to say mature, but they were definitely like upping the age range for the appeal for this style of game. Having this also be a game, like having Mega Man X also be a more, like, have a bit more character depth compared to the other Mega Man games. I think that's ultimately why I do have to say that Mega Man X is definitely the much deserved game to be the winner here. And if I'm going to be honest, this might be a very cold take, but I don't care. This is probably the best Mega Man game that's ever been made. And that's coming from someone who used to really not like Mega Man. But this game made me respect Mega Man. At least a bit more than I used to. But that's all I gotta really say. Mega Man X is just a decent little action platformer that I recommend you guys check out, if you haven't already. Alright, role-playing game. Again, this is going to be a pretty bloated category because the mid-90s was the renaissance for Japanese role-playing games. And it should not surprise you that most of the choices that are going to be on here are going to be JRPGs. There are some Western RPGs that are on here, but goddamn did Square and Enix really, really dominate this year as far as the JRPG. So, but let's start off by talking about Western games. Although before we do that, I do want to check something. Okay, yeah, I was correct on that assessment. Anyways, so let's start off by talking about the Western RPGs. So, Might and Magic 5, Dark Side of Xeen. So, of course, Might and Magic, long-running fantasy franchise that's been around since the mid-80s. Though, funny enough, this was one of the first games in the series that tried to go away from the typical fantasy tropes. It went to a more science fiction, science fantasy route, where they were adding a lot more advanced weaponry. I know that may not look like that in the cover, but trust me when I say this, it kind of was taking a lot of cues from Final Fantasy in the sense that it was adding a lot more advanced technology, which helped at least make it stand out compared to other Western RPGs, because most Western RPGs at the time were pretty much just straightforward fantasy games. So, yeah, it's decent as far as like trying to incorporate a lot of that, but that's all I gotta really say. Go check it out if that interests you, I guess. And then we got ourselves Shadowrun. This is an adaptation of the science fiction cyberpunk, I think, franchise. I only say think because it's definitely yeah, it's cyberpunk. It's just an older style of cyberpunk. Though the title card makes it look more like it's a fantasy thing. As a matter of fact, whenever I first saw that look, I thought it was a fantasy franchise. Turns out it was a sci-fi one. And this was another one that I think is actually pretty interesting in a lot of ways. It's an isometric top-down RPG that was released for the Super Nintendo. Not very common for consoles. Very common for DOS computers at the time. But the fact that they were able to do that on a system like the Super Nintendo, I think, gains it a lot of credit. And also, this game really did help popularize Shadowrun as an IP, because it was kind of it was originally a tabletop series, not too indifferent to something like Dungeons and Dragons, just in a science fiction universe. And for being a game that helps flesh out that particular universe, I think it actually deserves a lot more credit than people really give it. So yeah, Shadowrun, a decent little game. But let's not kid ourselves. This was the era of the Japanese RPGs, and we've got ourselves 4 of them here to represent this entire list. 3 of which are, of course, Super Nintendo. Should not surprise you. But we also got ourselves a Sega Genesis game. So let's start off with Secret of Mana, which is one of 2 of these Square Enix games. Again, Square Enix was they basically had a monopoly at the time for JRPGs. They weren't the only company, because obviously Enix existed as well. But goddamn, were there a lot of JRPGs that were being pushed out by them at the time. So, but as far as what makes this game stand out, well, this was one of the first games that was a fully fledged action RPG. Yeah, those were not super common at the time, especially in the JRPG market, until this game came out. And I think that really helped make this game stand out. And what also makes this game stand out is just how beautiful this game looks. Like, I don't know, just like the game looks so damn vibrant. And it's honestly one of the first games I could say has like a very colorful palette. Because a lot of games, I feel like from the 80s and even the early 90s a little bit, they tend to be very monocolor a lot of the time. Or they tend to be pretty bicolor. Like they only really have like either one general color scheme, or they have maybe, 2 colors representing the color scheme that they have. Not this game. This game pretty much uses all those 256 colors that the Super Nintendo offered to great effect. And as a result, it makes this game look vibrant and beautiful compared to many other games at the time. So, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, Secret of Mana is honestly a pretty decent little JRPG, action JRPG. And then we got ourselves The Illusion of Gaia, which, if you guys remember Terranigma from 1995, yes, this is actually the game that came out before that, as this was a part of that little sort of trilogy that Quintet made, which, by the way, Quintet also made ActRaiser. I forgot to mention that. But yeah, this was the second game in that sort of trilogy of RPGs that they were doing at the time. And this one was also an action RPG, but in a much different way. It wasn't as like dynamic, but just the general idea of having a fantasy game basically set in an alternate Earth I just find it to be pretty interesting. I mean, I like Warhammer, and Warhammer Fantasy is basically just an alternate Earth, and just to have like a JRPG that's basically just a similar concept to that, already I'm gonna be sold by that. And I don't know, I just like the way that they did it. I thought it was actually pretty cool, especially since this game also does have a pretty decent general art direction that I think is pretty cool. So check it out. Alright, next up we got ourselves Romancing Saga 2. Again, this is a Japanese only release for the time. Honestly, the Romancing Saga trilogy was originally Japanese only until fairly recently. And as far as being the sequel to a game that was already kind of a spinoff of Final Fantasy, not really. It's complicated. The general saga release timeline is complicated. Even Wikipedia can't even explain it properly. Basically, this series used to be a part of the Final Fantasy, like used to be a sub-series of Final Fantasy games until they were released on the Super Famicom, where they were made into their own thing. And as far as being being a series that is more influenced by mythological, like more mythology than like straight up fantasy, I think Romancing Saga 2 helped at least continue that storyline in a way in which it's intriguing for me. So I guess that's the best way to at least describe why I'm nominating this. It vibes. Ultimately, if I'm nominating a Japanese RPG on here, it's mostly because of vibes. Because a lot of them, I will admit, are very vibes based. You gotta really like the setting that they have in order for you to really enjoy it. And I mean, since this is more mythological based, I'm gonna like it. I mean, I'm a fantasy guy, so I'm gonna be biased about it. So, which of course brings us into our last game, Phantasy Star 4. Which, funny enough, very similar to Gauntlet 4. The previous Phantasy Star game was kind of considered a black sheep. But then this game totally fixed a lot of the problems that game had. And so this plays a lot more straightforward compared to Phantasy Star 3. It kind of went back to a lot of what made the first two Phantasy Star games, very respected in their own ways. And so, if you want a more straightforward JRPG that's on the Sega Genesis, that does have some light family tree mechanics, there you go. But let's not beat around the bush. A lot of these games, you could make a good case that they are the winners. But I think ultimately my choice here makes the most sense. So let's talk about it. So, the award for the best RPG of 1993 goes to Secret of Mana. Ultimately, I think this is probably the correct choice if we were to choose all of these, because I feel like this is probably the most influential game out of all the ones we just talked about, in many ways than just one. So, first of all, as I've already mentioned before, this game honestly has a very distinct and beautiful look that not a lot of games from this era kind of had. Because again, it was using a lot of pinks and yellows and oranges, along with your typical greens and your blues and your purples. It allowed for a lot more of a dynamic look that a lot of games weren't really utilizing up until this point. Coupled up with the fact that this game had proper real-time battles, which were not common on the Super Nintendo. Obviously, they were starting to become common as Illusion of Gaia would come out later down the line, and as well as some other action RPGs. But this was really one of the first to really do that for consoles. And I think that's worth a bit of praise. But here's also something that I failed to mention. Actually, didn't fail to mention, but I wanted to say for this. This was one of the first multiplayer RPGs ever made. Which, me playing through this actually surprised me. I did not know that this was a co-op RPG. You guys do not realize how huge of a deal that is. Because RPGs were typically made for one player in mind. The fact that this was a game that encouraged you to play with another person throughout the entire story is insane. That is something that, if you were a kid back in 1993, that would have blown your mind. So, honestly, I'd say that's a pretty big deal in its own right, and I think that alone already wins this here. But even just kind of besides that, of course, this game also is well known for its narrative. Basically, it's a general storyline about, being able to, trust, like, basically the idea of having trust and, recognition of friendship within your party. Well, not party, but just kind of the general characters that you're talking to throughout the game. And just general themes of corruption and all that fun stuff. Well, not fun, but you get the point. But also, I'd say one of the other big influences that this game helped bring as far as RPGs are concerned. This was one of the first games to have a quick, what do you call it? Oh, a quick menu. A quick inventory menu. Also known as the ring menu. So, a lot of RPGs utilize that mechanic, but this was one of the first, if not the first game to utilize that mechanic. It allowed you to be able to swap between different items and weapons on the fly without having to go to a separate screen for that. Again, a pretty big deal for the time. Something that we take for granted nowadays, but this game introduced. So, just with those gaming innovations and just the general look and feel of the game, I have to give this the best RPG for 1993. It's not really close in my mind. Which, speaking of not very close in my mind, I feel like I'm just gonna pad out this particular category, and I'm not even gonna pretend what's gonna, be the winner. It should be pretty obvious once you see the screen what the winner is for best shooter game is going to be for 1993. But even besides that, I'm still going to talk about some of these games because I think it would be pretty interesting to pretty much talk about some the other games that came out. Though I will admit, 93, even just for rail shooters and shoot 'em ups, it was just a very stale year. I'm not gonna lie. If it weren't for the game that we'll be talking about, well, that and another game on here, honestly, 93 would just be... if I'm gonna be honest, 93 would have been a very forgettable, if not one of the worst years for the shooter category. But let's talk about these games nonetheless. So, let's start off by talking about RoboCop versus Terminator. So, I guess this is just less to do with the RoboCop thing, because I don't actually really give a shit about RoboCop at all. Though I am someone who is a fan of the first two Terminator movies, and I even this is going to be embarrassed for me to say this, but I ironically like Terminator 3. It's not a good movie. I just ironically like that movie. But anyways, RoboCop versus Terminator. was released on both Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. It's just a general shoot 'em up action game that honestly was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. I played this game honestly a few days ago, like before the stream. I was surprised in just how much fun I was having with this game, especially for a movie licensed game from this era. Well, I guess not really a movie licensed game, more of a comic license thing. But like the fact that I was able to have fun shooting a bunch of robots and Terminators as RoboCop in this, and also just go through different levels. I don't know. It was really weird to me. I had a lot more fun than I thought I would with a game like this. So yeah, I recommend you guys find the Super Nintendo version of this game if you guys can. I haven't played the Genesis version. This is mostly the Super Nintendo version I'm talking about, but like, it's not that bad. It's actually a pretty decent little game. And well, speaking of shoot 'em ups and run and guns, we got ourselves the Chaos Engine. Now this one is kind of more. This one's like an isometric shoot 'em up. So it basically think if it was Contra but isometric, but like not in a shitty way. Like basically think of it as like a mix between like Commando and Contra. That's essentially what the Chaos Engine was. And yeah, I thought this one was also pretty decent as far as I'm concerned. So if you want something that's like that, there you go. Let's not kid ourselves. This category is really between two choices. So, Star Fox. This is the first game in the Star Fox series. And in hindsight, I really did not give this game enough credit whenever I first played it. And even replaying it for this stream tonight, honestly, this game is a lot more fun than I gave it credit for. Especially, and also this game was pretty innovative in its own right. This was one of the first 3D console games ever made, and this was for the Super Nintendo. Like, what? This is a Super Nintendo game? Goddamn. Like, it actually, like, at least thinking about it, it really does blow my mind. Because Super Nintendo, well, yes, it was definitely a much more graphically intensive game, like console, compared to the NES. Most of the games, and I mean most of the games, I mean like 99.999% of the games that were made for the system were still on a 2D plane. But then this game came out and was like, no, we're going to give it 3D. And it works in its benefit. It does have some admittedly kind of dated control schemes, especially since, well, you know, this is a rail shooter where there's not really an analog stick, which is kind of awkward for me personally. But even then, you can still fly around in a way that is still viable for a controller like this. And I'm just gonna be honest, this was some of the most fun I've actually had trying to do research for this. Like, this was honestly this was a lot of fun. So, easily a good contender. Also, we have Doom on here. Look. Doom. 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 Do I need to say anything else? Do I need to say anything else? You guys know why this is the winner. I don't even need to talk about this game, and you guys know it's going to be the winner. This is literally just the Doom category. Even though I respect Star Fox, don't get twisted. Star Fox is still pretty fun. It's Doom. 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 So it's Doom. It's Doom. It's Doom. It's Doom. And what's that last point right there? The little point. Oh yeah, it's Doom. It's Doom. Okay, I'm done with the bit. Okay, all jokes aside, I love Doom. It's one of my favorite games of all time. Of course, I'm gonna choose this as the winner. Movement combat, the different elevation of levels, the weapons that you got, like the shotgun, the chain gun, the the rocket launcher, the BFG, even the little pistol thing, which I know kind of sucks at late game, but it's still a decent early game pistol. It's just an iconic game around. Let's move on. I'm not wasting your guys' time on this one. Let's move on. Okay. Let's compose ourselves and let's actually talk about this next category, the Sim strategy category. Funny enough, 93, I noticed there was a major pattern with 93 in particular. There were a lot of like flights and space simulators that came out this year. Like if you're a big fan of flight sims or space sims, 1993 had you covered immensely. So let's talk about such games. But okay, before we get into the flight sims though, I think I do want to talk about the non-flight sim games here. So let's actually start off by talking about Syndicate. And by the way, I did just realize as well that I did not put those in the correct order for the text. God damn it. Anyways, so Syndicate is a real-time strategy game, question mark? It's kind of hard to describe. We did actually talk about its sequel a few episodes back. But yeah, it's essentially like a real-time strategy game, though not in the traditional sense, because again, this is pre-Warcraft 1 and this is pre-Command and Conquer. And so it plays a bit differently compared to those RTS games. It's still a general strategy game. You still manage your characters and move them around into specific patterns and positions so that they don't get like killed and all that fun stuff. But it's again not a strategy game. It's not like an RTS game in name. Honestly, I guess you can technically call this a real-time tactics game because you are in real time doing this. I don't know, it's hard to describe. But the general cyberpunk look that this game has, I think really does help make this one stick out, especially since there's really not a lot of those style of strategy games somehow, other than XCOM, but XCOM's not cyberpunk. So yeah, check it out if you guys haven't already. Other non-flight sim, we've got ourselves the City Builder, SimCity 2000. Should be pretty obvious as to why this one's getting nominated. It's the sequel to a game that was already extremely popular at the time. I will admit, it's not my favorite SimCity game. It's just a bit too dated in a lot of ways for me personally, but just a general graphic overhaul of SimCity, also adding in a lot more disaster scenarios, adding a lot more synergies between different districts that you set up in here really does make this a bit more of a cohesive experience. And I think that's at least worth something. And so, yeah, SimCity 2000, as far as city builders for the time, which, I mean, there really weren't that many, just didn't really reinvent the wheel, but you don't need to. Now let's talk about the flight sims. And we'll start off by talking about Microsoft Flight Simulator 5.0 or Microsoft Flight Simulator 5. So this was the first game in the series to kind of ditch away from the flat look of the first few games in this series. It wasn't quite fully 3D quite yet. That wouldn't be until the game after, but it was definitely a game that finally started to allow for more realistic elevation between different areas of Earth. Because again, this game tries, like, the whole point of Microsoft 5 Simulator is that it replicates the look of Earth. Like, it replicates the entirety of Earth. That was always the appeal of these games. And in this game's case, this was finally a major step compared to the general grasslands of literally every other game that came out before this. This actually had proper elevation as well as proper biomes. It wasn't quite to the level that it could have been later, but for the time, it was a decent enough of a step that I think is at least warranting a bit of a nod. And, I mean, Microsoft Flight Simulator has always been kind of a guilty pleasure series of mine, so I'm going to give it a nomination here. And then we got Star Wars X-Wing, a game that innovated a lot, yet not a lot of people mention that, and also helped break away from traditional, like, Star Wars games from just following the main storyline of the movies. This was the first game to branch away from that, and for the better, helping really build up the Star Wars universe to how it is to this day, or at least, well, did before, well, this and many things were made uncanon, but we don't talk about that. But I don't know, just the fact that this was pretty much, it was basically just Wing Commander, but Star Wars themed, which is ironic considering Mark Hamill would eventually work with the Wing Commander series later down the line. But the fact that this was also a game that honestly looked really good for its time. Like, this is a game from 93, and some of the visual designs, and, well, it being, again, very similar to Miss and Seventh Guest, one of the earliest 3D games to be made. I gotta be real, it helps with this game. It helps with the immersion, and helps with the general combat loop. It's just a generally really good game, even if it didn't have the Star Wars name attached to it. So, yeah, like, this game I would recommend. And hell, I'll even say this. Wing Commander Privateer is another game I would recommend. A spin-off, so it's not a part of the main Wing Commander series, it's more of a general space flight sim as opposed to a space combat sim. There is still some light combat sections in it, but don't think of it as being like a dogfighting game. Think of it as being more of just a general space travel with some light combat game. And I just find that to be kind of cool. Again, I'm someone who is at least a little bit biased in that respect, because space flight sims are honestly, or just flight sims in general, honestly, they have become one of my favorite genres. Like, going through this series has really made me appreciate the genre even more. And just going through a game like Wing Commander Privateer, and we'll get to Frontier Elite 2 in a second, really did make me appreciate a lot of the games that were made in this genre. And it really makes me wish that this genre was a lot more popular than it is. It makes me wish it was more popular. So, and well, as per usual with Wing Commander, the shooting and the actual combat sections that are featured in the game are still enjoyable as always. This one's just kind of more of a low-key game for the series, but it's still one that's enjoyable nonetheless. And then we got ourselves Frontier Elite 2, which, if that name sounds familiar, well, what if I told you that this is in the same franchise as 2014's Elite Dangerous? Yes, that game is a sequel to this game from all the way back in 1993. And this was a sequel to a game that came out, I think, in 88 or 89, I believe. But this game is much more of a traditional, just general space flight simulator. This one's not combat focused. It's just you exploring the galaxy. And I just find that to be pretty fun. I liked it with Elite Dangerous, and going back and replaying this, even though the controls are definitely, like, hard for a modern gamer perspective, it's still a game that I still really do respect. And just, I don't know, just some of the scenery that is in this game, and honestly, just all these all these space flight sims, they are just so beautiful looking. Like, I don't know how to describe it other than just being just kind of mesmerized. Granted, it's kind of awkward, at least with this game, because it's more of in a window, compared to, honestly, these other two games. But I still would recommend you guys check it out. Especially since, without this, we wouldn't have Elite Dangerous. And Elite Dangerous is honestly one of those games that I think is pretty cool. I know that game has gotten some shit recently, but it's still a game that I think is a technical achievement. And this game walked so that can run. So naturally, I think we have to nominate this. But let's go over the winner. It should not surprise you what game I'm probably going to choose as the winner. So, the award for the best sim strategy game of 1993 goes to Star Wars X-Wing. I was just playing this game yesterday, and I had a lot of fun. Granted, it is hard as fuck, but it's still a game that I think is pretty fun regardless. I mean, again, I keep pointing this out. This was one of the first 3D games. Obviously, I'm going to give a lot of credit where credit is due in that regard. But even just despite it being an early 3D game, this game still, or I guess at least in-game, in the menus, it's still 2D. But as far as being a game that was 3D for 1993, it honestly still looks really good. Aside with some, low poly, occasional low poly ship design here and there, this honestly was one of the most beautiful games that I was looking through while doing research for this. It really was a game that honestly I could just play for hours, just putting on my headset and using my PlayStation 5 controller with it. And yes, the fact that the special edition version of the game is controller compatible with modern controllers is insane to me. Like, I can literally use a controller 25 years after this game came out and it still works is just wow. But I don't know, I like that. But and well, that gets into my next point about this, is that out of all of the 3 flight sims that are actually that we nominated, this was actually the easiest one to get into. I mean, it's helped by the fact that the special edition exists, but even the original edition was a lot less cumbersome than you would think. And that's ultimately something that I have to give credit where credit is due to LucasArts. I mean, I don't know, I'm sorry. I'm gushing right now, but I really, 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 really have grown to like flight sims. So I guess I'm just kind of being I'm nerding out right now. But even just kind of putting that aside, obviously, this game generally has really good, like, just level design. Also, the sound, or I guess level design for the type of game that it is. But as far as general sound design as well, this was one of the first Star Wars games that actually felt like you were playing a Star Wars game, if that makes sense. Because this was a PC release, and this was one of the first games that started to really utilize a bigger storage capacity within the floppy disks that were used, which eventually, of course, the special edition would be later released onto CDs. This allowed for a lot more crispy audio to be used, and so a lot of the sounds that they used in the movies, they started to use in this. Like, it actually sounds like you're shooting the lasers from an X-Wing in the X-Wing, for example, or shooting a lot of the weapons from the Y-Wing, or hearing the TIE fighters shoot. Like, it felt like you were being immersed in the Star Wars universe. And that gets us to our last point, and probably the most important point here. Because up until this point, Star Wars games pretty much just followed the movies that they were based off of. Whether it was the Atari games, or the NES games, or hell, even the Super Nintendo games, and even PC games, they didn't really stray away from the main storyline. They were mostly just retellings of the movies. And while sure, there were comics that were made in the very late 70s and the 80s, Star Wars media didn't really start expanding itself until the early 90s, thanks to the Thrawn trilogy. And, well, with the release of Star Wars X-Wing, this allowed for a completely new interactive medium for them to expand the Star Wars universe for. And they took full advantage of that. Most of the levels in this game have nothing to do with the movies, except for the Battle of Yavin, and I think the Battle of Hoth is also in this game, although I don't remember. But considering those are the only two battles that were actually featured in the movies, and every other battle is set before and after A New Hope, it shows that they were able to really stretch out the lore of Star Wars. And that's just something that I have to give credit where credit is due. So yeah, Star Wars X-Wing, pretty innovative in a lot of ways. That then brings us to art direction, which of course is a category that usually I would choose a lot of games that we talked about already in our stream for. But this time around, I'm actually going to choose a lot of games that we've not talked about. There's still going to be some that we did mention here and there, but I wanted to give a few shoutouts to other games that came out in '93 for this category. So, Star Fox, Shadow in the Flame, and Secret of Mana, I am going to be giving nominations for, because Star Fox, for its innovative console 3D graphics, and even just being a cool little like anthro looking sci-fi thing going on there. Prince of Persia, Shadow in the Flame, for actually starting to look like a game set in the Middle East, having some really cool locales and like caves and temples and palaces and ruins, even if some of the enemies don't really make any sense, but that's besides the point. And Secret of Mana for its very bright, vibrant color palette and its fantasy anime look. But I'm also going to give 3 other nominations to other games that came out of 1993. Starting off with Clay Fighter. Now, normally I wouldn't really like these types of games because I'm not really the biggest fighting game fan. But this is a game, and here's the thing about this game, is that the Genesis version is a compromised version. And so I am mostly talking about the Super Nintendo version, but I am nominating this game for one thing and one thing only. They took an entire year making this game by using claymation for the stop motion characters that are used in this game. And the fact that it uses claymation as the general look for the game, I find to be extremely impressive. And something that was very unique at the time. And so because of that, I wanted to give this game an honor. I wanted to give this game a nomination. This game is 90s as hell. And truth be told, the sequels really weren't that good. But the original Clay Fighter, I think, is really something that I do want to at least give an honorable nomination for. So, yeah, Clay Fighter. There you go. Though I do have to mention, this is not original artwork. This is a fan work. I just had to use it because I wasn't able to find another picture that was able to fit in the screen like this. So I do apologize. And if you somehow stumble upon this, make sure you give yourself credit for this, because I could not find the artist for this. And then in regards to Disney's Aladdin, specifically the Super Nintendo version for this one as well. This is another platformer, very similarly to what we talked about with the Lion King game, also for the Super Nintendo. This game replicates the look of Aladdin very damn well. And also, truth be told, if I could have, I would have also nominated this for a Best Platformer category, because this game honestly plays really damn good. And truth be told, it's actually probably one of my favorite movie licensed games, just period. Alongside, you know, okay, maybe not Jurassic Park is one of my favorites, but it's definitely one of the better ones. I don't know, just the general look of this game, the animations, and just the general art design is just so damn good in this game. And of course, I'm a sucker for Middle Eastern settings. Of course, that's why I'm also nominating Shadow in the Flame here. I'm gonna do that for Aladdin. And then last but not least, we got ourselves the Lemmings 2, The Tribes. Of course, this is a sequel to 1991's Lemmings. And this game, I think, is definitely, again, it's a puzzle adventure game that, I mean, the puzzles themselves are actually pretty decent. But as far as the general look of this game, being a lot more of a cartoony parody of a bunch of different civilizations throughout history, I think is something that is pretty cool in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I wanted to give this game a bit of a nod for that. But let's go over the winner. Honestly, you can make a good case for any of these, but this is ultimately what I chose. So, the award for the best art direction of 1993 goes to Secret of Mana. Again, this is just how damn good this game actually looks. At least for me personally. Of course, this is the most subjective category, and so if some people don't like the look of this game, that is completely fair. But for me personally, I think this game looks really cool. Again, it has a very cool, like, I mean, the general art design already looks pretty decent. It's pretty much just a typical anime fantasy look, not too dissimilar to Final Fantasy. just more, I guess, more woods inspired. It's like, I don't want to call it medieval. I guess the closest thing to an aesthetic to this would probably be a mix. Like, it'd probably be like the any like woodland areas in a Final Fantasy game. That's kind of the look that this game goes for. Is a lot more of a natural environment. But the fact that this game also added in a lot of different colors to this color palette, it really does make this game look really damn good. And helps make it stand out compared to even a lot of its Super Nintendo contemporaries. Not just in the JRPG category, but just in any category. So yeah, go check out the Super Nintendo version if you guys can. I know the remake was kind of iffy with people, but if you guys seek out the original version, you guys might like it. But then we get ourselves into the last category, the Game of the Year. Oh shoot. Which, again, I think it should be pretty obvious what's going to be the winner here, if you guys know me. But I think regardless on like what is the winner here, you guys are definitely going to agree that the nominees were probably going to be the correct ones if the Game Awards were to have existed back then. So what did I end up choosing? Well, I chose Star Fox for its innovative 3D sections, as well as general awesome action stuff that they were able to do here. Or let me phrase that. Just the fact that they were able to use the 3D environments in a rail shooter like this and make it work and stand out compared to other Super Nintendo games. I think that pretty much warrants it a lot of credit. Star Wars X-Wing, because of the innovations that game brought in, not just to the flight sim genre, but also helping expanding Star Wars media into being just beyond the movies. Secret of Mana for its visual bliss and general art direction, as well as its gaming innovations in the RPG category. Myst for its cool puzzles and just general sort of mysterious mystique that Myst brings. Okay, that was a terrible pun, I'm sorry. But just the general puzzle solving and adventure and just the intrigue I find to be interesting in Myst. And then Doom for basically being the game that innovated first-person shooters as they are now, and being one of the most fun games that I remember streaming. And then Mega Man X for changing the game for Mega Man as a whole and making it into a respectable enough of a franchise that can go beyond just some of the typical trappings that a lot of platformers were doing at the time. So, really good choices here. I don't think anyone's going to complain about these being the Game of the Year nominees. But there's one winner. And it should be pretty obvious, if you guys know me, what's going to be the winner here. So, let's not waste any more time. So, the Game of the Year of 1993, without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, goes to Doom. I could make the same joke that I made earlier and it would still apply, but I'm actually going to be serious about this one this time around, because Doom is honestly one of my personal favorite games of all time. It should not surprise you that this is going to be the winner. But even just besides that bias, this game really did help changed the game as far as just shooter games as a whole. I mean, I could go on and on about how this game has really quick and snappy, fast action that no other game really had at the time. And is still fun to mess around with to this day. Like, I feel like I go to this game like every other month. That's how much I play this game, like, super often. This and Quake, those two games, I just feel like I've been going to constantly, like, over the past, like, several years. It is just a lot of fun to just move around in this game. And it doesn't even matter what version of the game it is. It can be the DOS version, it can be the the GZ Doom version, it could be the Bethesda re-released version. It doesn't matter. This game is still a lot of fun to mess around with. In just the movement and the shooting. Coupled that by just the iconic look of just the weapons, the enemies themselves, like the zombies, the imps, the cacodemons, the pinkies, which I know they were called demons at the time. The fucking goddamn it, the cyber demon, sorry, the spider mastermind, the barons of hell. This game just has so many iconic things about it, and even just the levels themselves, going through Mars and then going into the space station and then going into hell, honestly was just a lot. Like, this game just has very memorable just art design. And, well, due to the many different things that they upgraded compared to its previous shooter game, Wolfenstein 3D, actually adding in a lot of elevation, adding in a lot more dynamic, like adding in actual doors for you to be able to use, using, like, adding in different power-ups in here, adding in a lot more weapons for you to be able to use. It really did change the game for shooter games as a whole. It was the game that, like, opened the floodgates for the first-person shooter genre. It wasn't the first-person shooter. I mean, Wolfenstein 3D came out a year prior, and hell, there were even games that came out before that were first-person shooters. But this was really the game that pretty much made that into a staple. For better or for worse, it really was the game that pushed that into being pretty much the mainstream game that is still popular to this day, 31 years later. And of course, it's one of my favorite games of all time. Doom has really become a game that I do consider to be one of those games that you have to play before you die. It is that good and that important. And as a bit of a bonus, and actually, I'm actually going to add a little bit of this. It's not even a bonus this time. This is honestly one of the biggest points I do want to make about this game. Now, video game modding has been a thing technically since the mid-80s, but Doom was one of the first, if not the first game, at least that comes to my mind, that openly encouraged people to mod around it and to make their own projects out of it. Which is something that you unfortunately rarely see with a lot of games nowadays. At least when it comes to big box name franchises. The fact that Doom allowed for a platform for so much creative talent to be made and helped people actually even be able to help create their own games is a true testament to just the general design that this game has. So yeah, overall, easily game of the year, and I rest my case. Go play Doom. The point of this, I guess, the overarching point of this stream is if you guys haven't, go fucking play Doom now. You will not regret it. But yeah, that was the game of the year. But yeah, let's recap, shall we? So, as far as the awards that we gave out, of course, best game by new studio we gave out to Myst. Best action adventure went to Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Best platformer went to Mega Man X. Best RPG went to Secret of Mana. Best shooter game went to Doom. Best sim strategy went to Star Wars X-Wing. Best art direction went to Secret of Mana, and then the game of the year went to Doom. As far as my top 10 favorites, keep in mind this is kind of a interchangeable list, but as of right now, as far as my personal favorite games from 1993, they include Doom, Secret of Mana, Star Wars X-Wing, Star Fox, Myst, Mega Man X, Wing Commander Privateer, Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, Alone in the Dark 2, and Star Wars: The Empire, Super Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. But as far as guilty pleasures and honorable mentions, these are the other games I wanted to give a bit of a shout out to. Strike Commander basically was actually a spin-off of Wing Commander, but instead of it being in space, it was a flight combat simulator in atmosphere made by Origin. So kind of cool in that respect that they were trying to go into the air combat flight sim. So respectable. Breath of Fire, the original game, for another JRPG that is widely respected, so I wanted to give credit where credit is due. Operation Logic Bomb is like an action shooter game that, or like it's just a general action platformer that was decent for its time. Rock and Roll Racing was actually also made by Blizzard, and this was their attempt at a racer, which I thought was actually not too bad of a thing. And Super Mario All-Stars for basically just being a remaster of the first 3 Super Mario Brothers games for the Super Nintendo, which is pretty cool. Star Wars Arcade for offering a pretty decent arcade experience for people to mess around with when it comes to different scenes from Star Wars. Tetris 2. Yes, Tetris had a sequel on the NES. And that's Tetris 2. Again, Tetris is one of those things that's just a guilty pleasure of mine. So, yeah. Mega Man 6, I am going to give an honorable mention here. Though I will admit, it's definitely not the best Mega Man game. So, do keep that in mind. Equinox for just being a kind of a decent little action RPG-ish sort of game. Also, I'd be hard-pressed if I did not mention Mortal Kombat 2. Like, even though fighting games are not my thing, I do at least want to give respect to Mortal Kombat 2. Especially since this, along with the first game, were massive around this time, especially in arcades. But the console ports also helped raise this game's popularity. So as far as I'm concerned, if I didn't mention this, people would shoot me. Betrayal at Krondor is just a decent little action-adventure fantasy game that I thought was kind of cool. Quest for Glory 4, Shadows of Darkness, part of the Quest for Glory series of adventure pseudo-RPGs, but not really RPGs. They're just kind of fantasy adventure games that I think were kind of cool. Blade of Vengeance was just kind of a cool fantasy platformer that I discovered that I thought was cool. And then Eric the Unready was just another fantasy adventure game that was more of a loose parody of a lot of fantasy media at the time. So it was decent. But that concludes 1993. God, we are almost done with this. We're almost done with this series. We've got 3 more years of the 90s almost done. Just 3 more. And then I'm giving myself a break. Because if I'm going to be honest with you guys, and it should, if it hasn't been evident already, this series has exhausted me throughout this entire year. I started this series back in January, like late January, earlier this year. And don't get it wrong, it's been really cool being able to discover a lot of games that otherwise I probably wouldn't have really looked up myself or really just bring up to you guys. But God, I am getting so burnt out on this series. It's not even funny. And truth be told, I am not excited to get into the early 90s. I mean, yeah, we're still going to be talking about the Super Nintendo, and I really do like the Super Nintendo. But it's going to be really hard for me to be able to really talk about a lot of games, especially a lot of more well-known games from this point onwards. And so, if I have to give myself a bit of a break to do this series, I hope you guys at least do respect that. Because this series has been very exhausting for me to go through. But either way, I hope you guys do enjoy this, did enjoy this episode. Of course, if you guys are watching this on Twitch, of course, hit the follow button and the bell icon if you guys want to be notified exactly when I'll be streaming. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, of course, hit the like and subscribe. It would definitely help me out, and I would definitely appreciate it. Of course, if you guys can, check out all the stuff that's in the link below, specifically Linktree, Discord, and the SoundCloud. And if you guys haven't already, you can also hit the subscribe button over on Twitch if you guys want to directly support the content. If you can't necessarily do that, that's completely fine. I'm just glad that you guys took time to watch this. But regardless of all that, though, make sure to share the stream to other people as well. And continue to be awesome people in the process. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good night. And peace out. Have a good night, guys.